Minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ulrich, I just wanted you to clarify, in your testimony, you point out that non-federal crude oil production has more than doubled between FY 2006 and FY 2015, while at the same time, the federal share of our total U.S. crude oil production fell from its peak of 36% in 2010 to 21% in 2015. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, Congressman, that is absolutely correct based on Congressional Research Office numbers.
And at the same time, for us in Wyoming, actually just between 2015 and 2016, we've seen a 37% decrease in revenues from the mineral industry. The statistics paint a very clear picture. When you look at, for example, the amount of time that it takes for a state agencies on average to grant an application for a permit to drill, we're at about 30 days, whereas the statistics that we've got for the federal granting of such an application is 220 days. But that 220 days, I'm not sure we've actually seen that happen. I mean, talk about your experience. Your experience has been now we've got an 8-year delay. And while that may be something that some folks want to see happen, some other members of this committee, it's killing our energy industry, and it's killing the economy. And when we see the fact, for example, I'm very proud that my bill's got bipartisan support because these revenues that the state so badly needs go, for example, to serve schools in some of our most economically hard-hit areas. These are crucial revenues that the states need that we get from energy development, and that energy is powering this nation. So talk about the reality of the situation in terms of the time frame you actually are facing from your APD to, not even seeing it come to fruition at this point, 8 years later.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's critical to clarify the process. First, you lease those minerals, and then you either have to gain authorization through an existing resource management plan or an existing large-scale NEPA EIS process prior to granting of an APD. So for my case, 8 years and pending, in some cases 10 to 12 years from leasing, I have still not had the ability to drill in acreage we have in southwest Wyoming. So prior to me even submitting an APD, I need the EIS to be completed. And that process began in April of 2011 and continues to today. So we talk about the difference between an EIS level analysis and APDs, and an APD does take typically on federal lands between 3 months and 2 years. All of that is moot unless I have EIS level authorization to even apply for that permit to drill. And to date, for my project and a number of others in Wyoming, that is taking between 5 and 10 years, closer to 10 in most cases.
Thank you, Mr. Ulrich. And I also want to commend my colleagues, Ms. Black and Mr. Tipton, for their bills. I think that it's crucially important that we recognize that one size does not fit all, that our states are, in fact, the place where responsible regulation of our energy industry ought to be taking place. I also think it's important for us to recognize the reality, which is that those who are closest to our land, whether we're talking about our energy industry or our ag industry, our county commissioners, the people that understand the issues most directly and are most directly impacted by them, are the best stewards of that land. And the notion that somehow the BLM or the Forest Service has really been managing for multiple use and sustained yield is simply not true. And all you've got to do is spend some time, for example, as I did recently on the Thunder Basin grasslands, to see the absolute decimation in that case because of totally misguided prairie dog policy. And so I want to make sure we recognize how important it is that these bills, including Mrs. Black's bill, really require states to have policies in place that are approved by the Secretary of the Interior, but that will allow for us to get access to these resources we need. And these resources, Mr. Chairman, are resources that are national treasures, resources that we have to exploit for economic growth and development, and resources that we know how to exploit in a way that takes care of protecting our environment and protecting the true multiple use and sustained yield principles that by law our federal agencies are supposed to have been applying but have actually not been. I'd like to thank all the witnesses, and I'll yield back my time. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. We decided to go to a second round because we got some other questions. Ms. Bergen, unless you have some questions.
I want to ask about H.R. 3565. My understanding from the bill is that it would exempt the Endangered Species Act. Is that correct? Mr. Ruppel, do you know about that?
Yes. Yes, H.R. 3565 would exempt oil and gas permitting administered by the states on federal land from the Endangered Species Act.
Could you give me a little more detail about how exempting the oil and gas industry from the Endangered Species Act requirements can end up negatively affecting others?
Well, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is charged by Congress with preventing the extinction of species. So if the Fish and Wildlife Service is in a position where they're unable to regulate activities that imperil a species on those federal lands, they're going to have to look to either other industries or other lands where they can then protect the habitat necessary to maintain those species. So that means that other operators on federal lands, whether they be livestock grazers or mineral developers, recreation interests, those folks are going to see a heightened regulatory burden. It means those entities on state trust lands that may be developing energy as well may also see a heightened burden in maintaining species viability.
You also point out in your testimony that the vast majority of federal actions don't require an environmental impact statement. Could you describe the type of oil and gas project that does require an EIS?
Yes, as I mentioned in my testimony, according to the GAO, less than 1% of all NEPA projects require an EIS, but there are certainly extraordinary large projects that do rise to that analysis. The project I mentioned very briefly is the Greater Natural Buttes Field Development in Utah. That's a project that was developed, that was approved in 2012. It involves roughly 163,000 acres, 3,675 new wells, over 1,100 miles of pipeline, total new surface disturbance of upwards of 12.7 square miles, almost 600 miles of new access roads. It has 2 man camps. It involves almost over 7,500 acre feet of freshwater use to support drilling, and it produces 1,385 acre feet per year of produced water that has to be disposed of. This is in an area that has significant problems with attaining the Clean Air Act requirements for ozone, and an area where we also have sage grouse. So it's a project that has significant impacts, and it was approved following an open and public process.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, we hear a lot about states, about how much better the states are at regulating the oil and gas than the federal government. But there's consistently been news stories about how state regulatory agencies are understaffed, how they're overworked, and often unable to adequately protect human health and the environment. Unfortunately, actual data is very tough to obtain from the states themselves. Can the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission get us actual data on state regulatory programs, such as the regulatory budget in each state, the number of field inspectors, the training regimen for these inspectors, how often each well is inspected, the number of enforcement actions, and so on?
Congresswoman, we can try. We have a lot of that information. We certainly can be a benefit to provide what we have, and I would be most willing to do that.
Well, great. Well, I look forward to following up to getting that information that you do have. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you.
I thank the gentlewoman. We're going to go to a second round as talked about. Mr. Smith, I want to go back to you right now. You stated in your testimony that the IOGCC has been advocating in favor of empowering the states to regulate oil and gas resources within their borders for years. Do the states have the ability to regulate oil and gas development on federal lands, and do your member states wish to take on those responsibilities?
Yes, sir, and yes, sir, both. We do have the ability. We've got the agencies in place. We've got the personnel in place. We've got the expertise. We've been doing this since the 1930s. And we have a huge cadre of, and in response to the Congresswoman's request, I'll supply that to the committee. We have a in spite of the fact that our states have limited budgets, we have in each state given the resources needed with the expansion of the oil and gas industry. Pennsylvania is a great example. They have tripled their field inspectors in the Marcellus Shale simply because they had a smaller, 10 years ago, had a smaller regiment of production, and now it's greatly increased. That's just one example. That's in Ohio and in the Dakotas and Wyoming and Oklahoma and Texas and others. We've greatly increased that, and we do have the ability to assist on all of the federal government on all those federal lands. In fact, we're doing it now. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Chairman, a lot of these wells are drilled on property that's owned, the minerals owned by the federal government as well as the state and private ownership. And so there's a field inspector and a regulatory body that looks after those wells on a daily basis and works in some cases, as the committee has heard, with BLM officials, but in other cases just simply the state inspector himself and gives reports. So yes, sir, it's something that's been going on for decades, and my governors are ready, willing, and able to assist the Congress in implementing these 3 bills.
Mr. Smith, Mr. Ferrate, Mr. Ulrich, how will delegating primacy authority to the states for the regulation of oil and gas development on federal lands address the unique challenges in each state? Start with you, Mr. Smith, and work our way down.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. It'll work. I think Mr. Ferrate mentioned it earlier. There is precedent for it, a 30, 40-year precedent with the Environmental Protection Agency on Class 2 disposal wells, primacy for saltwater injection. In fact, my home state of Oklahoma was the first to obtain primacy, and each state can apply individually, and then there's oversight, and the bills, as Congresswoman Cheney said, recognizes oversight by the Secretary of Interior, much as the administrator of the EPA and staff oversight the Class 2 saltwater disposal well regime. So, yes, sir, it has worked very well. There's precedent for it, and the states are well equipped to handle it. They've been doing it in other areas for a long time.
Mr. Ferrate.